Hello and welcome to The Whole Equation. Watching TV shows these days requires a big commitment of time and energy. But following a story over several years also creates a huge emotional investment in the show. So when it comes time for a show to end, there's a lot of pressure on writers to get it right.
Happy with how things ended. Yeah.
Unfortunately, many of the biggest shows in the past couple of decades have had at best mixed reactions, or sometimes completely flopped.
Best season ever!
So, why does this keep happening? Well, of course, every show is different, and every show fails in its own way. But these failures are also indicative of broader trends that have been happening in TV. So today, we're going to look back at how we got here, and why I think bad finales are here to stay. One of the most important reasons stems from the fact that TV has become a long-form medium. Back in the 90s, TV shows were still largely episodic. The narrative arc of these shows only extended over a single episode, and by the end of the show, characters would be back where they started, ready for them to pick up in the same place for next week's episode.
It seems like every week something odd happens to The Simpsons. My advice is to ride it out, make an occasional smart aleck quip, and by next week we'll be back to where we started from, ready for another wacky adventure. Ay caramba!
There may have been some overarching storylines, but audiences could still dip in and out of a show without having to worry about missing an episode. This was largely a consequence of what the medium was at the time, where audiences watched primarily on live TV and didn't have the option to go back to an episode if they missed it. However, this began to change in the late 90s. Shows like The X-Files transitioned from a Monster of the Week format,
because I can,
to include a longer overarching storyline. TV was entering a new era where shows gave up the episodic structure for serialized stories told over multiple episodes and seasons. And I think this shift happened for two primary reasons. The first of these was the success of HBO's original programming. By offering almost complete creative freedom to writers and showrunners, HBO created many of the greatest shows of the era, including perhaps the two greatest of them all, The Sopranos and The Wire. These shows included complex narrative arcs, taking place over 60+ hours of television, and included in-depth examinations of character psychology, as well as broader sociological issues. The scope of these shows was beyond anything which had been portrayed on TV, or even film before, and hence were more often compared to novels.
What do they teach you this crap at school?
For the first time, this gave TV a prestige which changed how the medium was perceived. However, the second reason TV changed was technological. The DVD box set meant that shows could now be watched at any time, ensuring that the audience would experience the complex narrative in the correct order, without the danger of missing an episode and losing the story. This change was further solidified with the rise of streaming services, which gave the audience greater access to even more shows to watch at their own pace. However, now every drama had to take in a long-form story. Unfortunately, most networks hadn't fully reckoned with what made HBO's shows so great in the first place. A new wave of long-form shows followed, which had intriguing, high-concept premises. There was a show where a suburban parent starts selling drugs, and one about a serial killer who kills other serial killers. However, arguably the most important and influential show of this next generation was Lost. Lost started with a central mystery. A jet crashes on a deserted island, and it included a large cast of characters having to make their way in this new environment. It was a promising setup, but the writers also cranked it up to 11, with a variety of mysterious happenings.
Bear.
Like the appearance of a polar bear, a character who miraculously regains the ability to walk, a nefarious group of native islanders, and a, smoke monster? The writers, by their own admission, hadn't worked out where any of this was going, and through its run, Lost's storylines became increasingly convoluted. The big problem, which Lost exemplified, is that while it's easy to set up an interesting premise, it's much more difficult to tell a satisfying story over the course of multiple seasons. And this is the central dilemma of all long-form TV. Instead of the narrative arc taking place over a single episode, it now took place over the course of tens or even hundreds of episodes. And writers were expected to tell us a story without knowing how many seasons the show will have, or even where the show is going. The irony was that long-form TV shows were becoming increasingly compared to film, but there's a fundamental difference in how they are made. Films work when they have a strong story arc, and a good screenwriter will often have an end in mind for the characters before they have even written the whole story. This is because a good story arc requires characters to be taken on a journey in which they learn something or change in some way. For example, you might have a character who starts out young and idealistic, perhaps rejecting their background and trying to make their own way.
That's my family, Kate. It's not me.
However, circumstances beyond their control force them to change, which leads them to become a different person, perhaps darker or more cynical about the world. Knowing where characters will end up makes it much easier to ensure that the story arc makes sense in the context of the plot and gives the audience a satisfying emotional payoff. However, in the case of TV, writers are expected to write without the certainty of an ending. Then when it comes time to tie things up, characters are too often given endings which feel rushed, or don't really fit the journey the character had been on. And perhaps the biggest example of this was the infamous final season of Game of Thrones. Now, there were lots of problems with the final few seasons of Game of Thrones, and these have been explored in detail elsewhere. But one of the primary issues was that the writers didn't seem to understand the arcs which their characters had been on. To give just one example, take the character of Jaime Lannister. Jaime had started the series as the archetypal good-looking but arrogant and selfish lord, overly prideful in his fighting skill and devoted to the malevolent Cersei, who brings out the worst sides of Jaime's character. However, after losing his hand in Season 3 and becoming estranged from Cersei, he had slowly become a more thoughtful character and gained a sense of humility. Unfortunately, in the final series, rather than see this character arc through, the writers have Jaime return to Cersei and ultimately abandon his redemption arc. This was a problem repeated throughout the final season of Game of Thrones. Seemingly huge plot revelations ended up having little consequences for the characters.
You're real, Father.
And instead, they made bizarre decisions, not motivated by the plot.
And who has a better story than Bran the Broken?
One of the lessons here is that if a show is going to have a successful final season, it's crucial that the writers know where they want the characters to end up. And while this is difficult in TV, it's not impossible. As exemplified by the show, which arguably had the greatest final episode of them all. Breaking Bad started as another show with a high concept premise. A high school chemistry teacher, Walter White, finds out he has cancer and needs to pay for his medical bills, so he starts making meth. However, this premise sets in motion Walter's 5-season-long character arc, where he gradually descends into sociopathic criminality. The show contrasted Walter's arc with Jesse, who went from petty criminal to slowly becoming the moral centre of the show. Walter's redemption in the final episode brings both of these arcs to their natural conclusion, giving the audience a sense of emotional closure which few other shows have managed. Head writer Vince Gilligan might not have known how many seasons Breaking Bad would run for, or precisely know every beat of the story, but he did have a clear idea of the trajectory of the central characters, and wrote with this in mind, So when we got an ending, it was immensely satisfying.
Breaking Bad was a very closed-ended and finite story, and that is a bit atypical for television.
Unfortunately, Breaking Bad's ending is the exception to the rule, and few writers have managed to pull off such a great finale. However, it would be unfair to lay all of the fault with writers, and I think the problems run deeper than this. The reason so many shows end poorly comes down to incentives.
Typically, the economics of television reward you for going on indefinitely, for going on forever, essentially.
When a network or streaming service has a successful show, their main incentive is to keep the audience watching, rather than worry about character development or how a show will end.
You can look at stories as, they have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? But so much of television is that it's got a beginning, a middle, until the whole thing dies of exhaustion. It's been beaten to death, and then you figure out a way of ending it. You know what I mean?
In the era of long-form drama, one of the most unfortunate trends is the reliance on cliffhangers and other forms of plot suspense to keep the audience engaged. In the 90s, shows like The Simpsons and Twin Peaks satirized cliffhangers, seeing them for what they were, cheap devices imported from soap operas. Soap operas, of course, famously don't end. But long-form TV does, and stories can be stretched out beyond what should be their natural extent. Similarly, cliffhangers spill over seasons, meaning the audience often doesn't get any resolution until the final episodes, which puts a lot of pressure on the ending being right. This problem is further exacerbated because in this model of story writing, the plot is often an end in itself, rather than a vehicle to drive forward character development.
Air Force One is descending through 20,000 feet.
Shows lurch from one cliffhanger to the next, and rather than developing characters, writers prioritize building to the next big set piece. But TV needn't be like this, and an interesting contrast is to look back at one of the early long-form shows, one which had no cliffhangers and is for me the greatest show of them all. Ew! The Wire was a hugely ambitious show, but made up of relatively self-contained seasons, each examining a different place and different themes. It also had a wide range of characters, all of which have their own story arc. Instead of a cliffhanger, the season finales provide resolution to the characters' stories, and become more emotionally resonant because we've seen the characters learn and grow over the course of the season. It's arguable that The Wire's final season is its weakest, but it ends up mattering far less, as the show has not been building to this final episode resolution.
All in the game, yo.
In contrast to The Wire, shows which rely on suspense and cliffhangers are the processed sugar of entertainment, enjoyable while being consumed, but ultimately leaving an empty feeling.
Jack, you did good, real good.
However, there is some hope. One of the most promising developments in recent years has been the rise of anthology shows and miniseries. This makes sense, as the format allows writers to plot out their story arc over a limited number of episodes, providing the resolution which so much of long-form TV lacks. Likewise, there's still room for experimentation, at least in some corners. David Lynch's Twin Peaks revival and Donald Glover's Atlanta have completely thrown out the traditional narrative arc, in favour of shows which are more interested in themes and atmosphere.
Hey, paper.
However, personally, what I really miss is episodic TV. Comedy shows like The Office and Parks and Recreation manage to hold on to the episodic format for much longer than dramas, not succumbing to full-blown serialization until well into their final season. These shows are still immensely popular on streaming services, and it's a shame there doesn't seem to be a new generation of shows building on their success.
What? I gave a kid pee pants?
Yes.
Well, that's why I do what I do.
Ultimately, I think episodic TV is due a revival, as audiences crave a more casual viewing experience without the commitment which long-form TV demands. While much of episodic TV was formulaic, it could also produce beautiful stories within the limited time frame.
Goodbye, Lisa, honey. It'll be okay. Just read the note.
In contrast, few shows in the current crop of TV have much interest in creating these moments, instead filling their runtime with constant plot twists and cliffhangers. This is a shame, as for a while in the early 2000s, long-form TV looked like a new medium, telling moving stories of unparalleled complexity. And it still could be, so long as writers and producers move away from pandering to audiences and concentrate on telling great stories.